They called it observation, but we called it what it was, abandonment, because when Earth bled, when our skies cracked open and our oceans boiled with silence, they were there, watching, not helping. Not speaking, just orbiting in silence while we buried our cities and our children in the same breath. We screamed once, they recorded it, then we went quiet, not because we were broken, but because we were waiting. And now, centuries later, as the stars drift above with their cold machine eyes, something has changed. Earth is still, but it is not sleeping, it is looking back. And for the first time since they arrived, the galaxy feels fear not from our weapons, but from the silence we've carried so long it became something sharper than war. This is not a story of revenge. It is the story of how memory rose from ashes and made the stars tremble. They did not come to destroy us with fire. They did not bring fleets or weapons or demands. They did not say a word, they just watched. Long before the sky cracked open, long before our cities fell beneath the weight of our own mistakes, long before the last governments turned to dust, the Watchers were already there, hidden above the clouds, orbiting in silence, eyes open wide with ancient patience. They said it was policy, they called it ethical distance, but we knew better. It was abandonment. It was the galaxy letting Earth burn while it recorded every scream. They came not when we reached the stars, but when we began to reach for each other. When our planet became louder than it had ever been, filled with signal and noise and the messy chaos of a species learning to care and to fail at the same time, they came to observe, not to help, not to speak. Just to record. Their machines were flawless. Their observation platforms moved like ghosts between clouds. No one on the surface saw them at first, but some felt them. Pilots who flew too close to the upper stratosphere. Miners who picked up strange feedback on unconnected radios. Children who looked up and whispered that the stars felt colder now. We knew something had changed, even if we could not see it. But then came the fall. Not from invasion, from inside. A war or maybe a collapse, no one agrees anymore. All we know is that one day the streets went quiet and the sky never blinked. The satellites above us died. The cities below us choked. And across it all, high in the clean vacuum where no scream could reach, the Watchers continued their vigil, cold, still, distant, every death, every fire, every broken cry from a child who no longer believed in sunlight. They watched all of it. And did nothing, not because they could not, but because they had already made their choice. We were not to be saved, we were to be studied, and so we fell quietly, slowly, like something tired of asking to be seen. But the thing they never understood, the thing no sensor could measure, was that humanity does not die the way other species do. We do not vanish. We sink into ourselves. We bury our stories in ash and blood and keep breathing anyway. In the silence after the collapse, there were still voices, not many, not loud, but they survived in old tunnels, in frost-covered libraries, in shelters too deep for orbit to hear. Mothers told stories to children by candlelight. Fathers carved names into stone. A soldier in the last ruins of Paris etched a message into the steel bones of a building and whispered it to no one. It was not hope, it was memory. The kind of memory that sticks to bones and refuses to let time erase it. And through it all, the Watchers never blinked, even when our skies turned red, even when we set entire forests ablaze just to keep warm, even when the oceans began to choke on silence. They stayed, watching, recording, categorizing our extinction like a beautiful tragedy unfolding at just the right speed. But they missed something, because in all that observation, they never once stopped to feel what they were looking at. They never once wondered what it would mean for a world to fall and remember the ones who watched it happen. Time moved, the earth changed, life did not vanish, it shifted, slower, quieter, smarter, not in the way machines understand, but in the way grief understands. The children who grew up beneath broken stars did not cry for what was lost. They listened to the wind, to the soil, to each other, and somewhere beneath the last ruins of the old world, something began to stir. Not a rebellion, not a weapon, just a question, a quiet, burning question that would pass from one child to the next, like a thread of fire through the cold. Why did they watch? That was all. That was enough. The question became a rhythm. The rhythm became a pattern, and the pattern became a memory that did not fade. It grew, in the cracks of collapsed towers, in the circuits of salvaged machines, in the bones of the earth itself. And above it all, still watching, the orbiters stayed blind to the most dangerous thing of all, the gaze that would one day turn upward, because Earth never forgot. Humanity never truly vanished, and silence, they were about to learn, is not always surrender.
Sometimes it is the deep breath before the answer. Now something has shifted, not in the sky, in the feeling behind it. The watchers who have hovered so long in comfort are noticing small things. A rise in static along the ionosphere.
Interference where no signals should exist. Dreams they cannot explain. Officers waking with names on their tongues they have never heard before. The galaxy begins to whisper warnings. Protocols are reviewed. Councils are called, and yet Earth does nothing. No transmissions, no threats, just the same old silence. But this time, it is not the silence of survival. It is the silence of focus. Something is aligning. Something ancient and grieving and wide as the world itself, and for the first time since their ships arrived, the Watchers feel something they do not have a word for, because Earth is looking up, not with vengeance, with memory, and the stars are no longer sure they want to be seen. They said nothing because they believed they had said everything that mattered in silence, and in that silence they believed there would be peace, or at least a kind of forgetting, but the truth was colder than that, quieter too, because silence is not always peace, and what filled the orbit above Earth was not stillness born of mercy, but observation sharpened by fear. The sky above was not empty, it was full of satellites wrapped in alien alloys that bent light around their edges. Full of survey vessels shaped like drifting bones, quiet and patient, each one older than the civilizations it observed, full of drones that moved in formation but never spoke, always watching, always logging, always learning. Full of species too far from Earth to be held accountable, but close enough to harvest the silence we never asked them to understand. They filled the sky with eyes, with ears, with artificial minds that translated everything we did into data, into projections, into graphs that said we were doomed long before we proved them right. But they never spoke, not once, not when the air cracked with radiation, not when the last climate barrier fell, not even when a child cried out for someone, anyone, to answer. That silence was not an accident, it was design, and every orbiting eye knew what it was watching. They were not witnessing a failed experiment, they were witnessing a collapse made convenient, made distant, made useful, because Earth was always loud, too wild. Our signals reached too far. Our questions never stopped. Our stories were filled with heroes who bled and villains who cried. Our music held too much pain to be mathematically pleasing. Our wars burned too bright on sensors made to study light, not life. We made the stars uncomfortable. We reminded them of things they buried in their own pasts, of the times when they too were young and fragile and full of wonder that had not yet calcified into doctrine. So they watched, and in watching they tried to convince themselves they were different, that they were above it, that what they observed was only a species proving its own weakness, but deep down they knew. They knew the orbit was not neutral, it was judgment, and they wore that judgment like armor, even when they did not speak, because as long as they watched, they did not have to act. As long as Earth stayed beneath them, broken and burning and barely breathing, they did not have to answer the question they refused to ask: what if they survive? The Watchers called it the Great Observation. A period of quiet oversight, a non-interference clause, but to those who lived beneath their gaze, it was something else. It was the cold sky. It was the sense of being seen but not heard. It was the echo that came before every final breath. It was the knowledge that someone was always out there, always calculating your worth in silence. Survivors knew. They built their homes in shadows. They told stories of gods who floated above with silver eyes. They painted warnings on broken satellites that fell like shooting stars. Some whispered prayers to the Watchers, not because they believed they would answer, but because they wanted to be heard at least once before they died. And through it all the Watchers kept orbiting, unmoving, untouched, unfeeling, until one day the sky looked different. It began with the lights, faint at first, barely a flicker in the lower atmosphere. Then patterns, then rhythm. Cities long thought dead pulsed with energy not drawn from reactors, but from movement coordinated, intentional, vast. Forests shifted in strange synchrony, as if listening. Storms began forming in perfect spirals, not chaotic, not random, but precise. Orbital scans showed the same message across continents.
not words, not code, but presence, a planetary rhythm. Earth was not speaking. Earth was breathing, and the watchers felt it not in their machines, but in themselves, in their dreams, in their nerves, in the way their eyes began to sting when they stared too long. Some dismissed it. Some called it atmospheric interference, but others, the old ones, the sensitive ones, the ones who remembered what it meant to fear, they knew something was waking, not an army, not a weapon, a question. A presence, a gaze. Earth was beginning to look up, not with satellites, not with missiles, with attention, with something older than signal, with something deeper than speech, and the watchers, so used to being unseen, began to feel it. Ships drifted off course without cause. Data feeds began looping fragments of old Earth broadcasts. A single pulse echoed across relay networks, not a transmission, just a pause, perfectly timed. Something was aligning. Not in orbit, in meaning, in memory, and for the first time, those who watched began to ask each other what they were really witnessing, because the sky was full of witnesses, but now the Earth was watching them. And there was no protocol for that. They thought nothing could survive. They assumed the cities would collapse into silence, the oceans would turn sour, and the last of humanity would scatter into myth like dust after impact. They wrote off Earth's grief as terminal, too much fire, too many ruins, too many broken songs echoing across the wreckage of a civilization that had screamed too long and finally gone still. They believed we would fade like so many others had before us, primitive and proud, too loud to last. But beneath the ash and shattered towers, beneath the bones of satellites fallen from orbit and buried in silence, something was waiting, not an army, not vengeance, just memory, slow, patient, ancient memory that refused to die even when every reason to breathe was taken away. The stars above saw only the surface. They saw the burning, the screaming, the sudden quiet. What they missed was what we buried in the quiet, what we became in the waiting. They never understood that humanity does not measure survival in time. We measure it in story, and beneath the rubble we kept telling it. We did not rebuild the way they expected. We did not reach again for the old machines or light the sky with hunger for the stars. We dug. We remembered. We sat in circles by firelight under fractured skies and whispered names into the wind. Not names of heroes or nations or empires. Names of people, names of streets, names of gardens that no longer grew and songs no one had sung in generations. We planted them like seeds into the dirt, and the earth, cracked and tired and scarred, listened. It did not bloom the way it once had. It did not roar back to life, but it began to pulse, not like technology. Like presence, like something that had been wounded so deeply that its only answer was to hold on, not to hope, but to remember. The children of that time did not speak of the watchers in orbit the way we once did. They did not fear them, they did not honor them. They simply knew them, knew they were there, knew they saw, and in that knowing they began to change. Some said the dirt itself began to hum. That if you stood still long enough with your hands in the soil, you could feel it, a soft vibration, slow and steady, like a heart buried deep beneath stone. Others spoke of dreams where the stars bled, where silence broke open and poured memory down like rain. And others, the oldest, the ones who had survived the worst winters, said that it was not Earth that had changed but us, that we had become quiet enough to hear ourselves again, that in the absence of rescue we had turned inward and found something stronger than help, something waiting. They carved symbols into the bones of the last great machines, not for function, for rhythm. They sang into the canyons where once there had been cities. They lined the walls with echoes, and those echoes never faded. It was not magic. It was not science. It was grief practiced so well it became architecture. A grief we wore like a second skin, not to mourn, but to mark. The Accords fleets above began to notice strange energy patterns, not aggressive, not mechanical, organic, rhythmic, coordinated but not transmitted. Something was moving beneath the crust, not machines, not people. Intention, they logged it, they studied it. They reported anomalies in thermals, in resonance frequencies, in the quiet flicker of radiation that suggested vast synchronization. But they had no context, no language for what was unfolding, because it was not a system, it was becoming. Earth was remembering itself, not in parts, as one, a planetary alignment not of government or will, but of grief held so deeply that it had forged unity without command. Humanity had not built a new world, it had become one. The Watchers could not comprehend it. Their models broke, their algorithms collapsed. They expected rebellion or extinction, not this. Not a people who had chosen to respond to death by becoming soil and rhythm and breath again. The silence they once interpreted as defeat was not absence. It was preparation, a stillness so complete it became terrifying, because nothing moved the way Earth now moved, quiet, unified, intentional. And still without a word, the observers began to disagree. Some argued for contact. Others warned that it was too late, that what they were seeing was not the rise of civilization again, but the awakening of a presence no longer human in the way they understood. A presence that had outgrown speech, that had endured too much to explain itself to those who only watched. Down below, the children who had grown up in ash began to hum in harmony with birds that had never stopped singing. The elders sat beneath dead trees and listened to the roots shift. Language faded, not into ignorance, into communion. Across oceans and broken wires, the same patterns emerged. Lines carved into stone that matched others 1,000 miles away. Stories whispered in one ruin that appeared in another. Not coincidence, memory, rising, linking, becoming. The Watchers called it a phenomenon. Earth called it breath. It was not a weapon. It was not a threat. It was the most human thing we had ever done. We endured, and in enduring we remembered everything, every voice lost, every promise broken, every orbiting eye that never blinked while we bled, and now we were beginning to lift our heads again. Not in defiance, in presence, not with sound, with attention, and far above where the Watchers floated in silence, something new began to settle in the air around them, a feeling they had forgotten how to name. Not dread, not awe, something older, something closer, something waiting. They searched for signals always. The Watchers had spent entire lifetimes scanning Earth for transmissions, for beacons, for the digital cries they assumed would one day erupt from the ashes, desperate, loud, human. But Earth had gone quiet, not in failure but in choice. It did not reach out, it did not scream, and so they told themselves there was no message, no story, just silence. They were wrong. Because buried in the crust of a forgotten relay tower, beneath a continent once carved by war, was something the stars had missed, a pulse, weak, fractured, lost in noise, but still alive, the final Terran transmission. Not a call for help, not a surrender, not even a goodbye, just one message, one echo, one whisper wrapped in radiation and dust, caught between broken channels where no sane mind would think to listen. The transmission was not addressed to the stars. It was never meant for them. It was meant for us, for those who would rise again, for those born from silence, carved from grief, and shaped by memory that refused to die. And when it played at last, when the Watchers decrypted what they believed to be a final, meaningless burst of ancient noise, they heard something they were not ready for, not static, not speech, but a voice. Human, steady, and terrifyingly calm. This is not a request, this is not a prayer, this is not an apology. We are not asking to be saved, we are not asking to be seen, we are not asking for time. If this reaches you, whoever you are, wherever you orbit, then know this. We saw you, we always did. We saw you watching, we saw you measuring, and we did not speak because you did not earn our voice. We gave you silence, because silence is what the dead deserve, and we were dying, but now you have heard us, and that means something has changed. The voice was female. Young, but not naive, a cadence that carried no hate, only certainty, and when it ended there was no signature, no encryption, no identity, just a sudden cut in the signal, not because the transmission failed, but because the message was complete. The stars had waited centuries for Earth to speak, and this was all they would get, one message, one moment, one impossible truth. Earth had never tried to speak to them, because Earth was never speaking up. It was speaking forward. This was not a broadcast, it was a seed, left to wait beneath ruins, beneath ash, beneath gravity and time and sorrow, left to wait for the future, for the children who would one day stand again on soil they did not build but would still call home. And now those children were waking, and the stars were finally listening. Too late, the Watchers panicked, the fleets above Earth scrambled, data logs were re-examined, old relay towers were excavated in orbit.
The message was replayed, analyzed, broken down into emotional patterns, cadence intervals, breath spacing, but none of it helped, because it was not just what was said, it was how. The message did not ask. It did not hope, it simply was, and that was the one thing the Watchers could not understand, that presence itself could be power, that silence could be weight, that grief could evolve into unity without ever becoming war. The oldest among them remembered rumors. Whispers of a Terran doctrine never officially confirmed the echo principle, a concept theorized in the final days before collapse, that if Earth were to fall, it would not beg. It would remember that if its children were lost, it would bury their voices so deeply into the bones of the planet that even time could not silence them. A defense, not of weapons, of identity, of story. And now the story had reached the surface again. Humanity had not sent probes. It had sent a memory. Humanity had not asked for help. It had left behind its own judgment. And now, long after the stars chose to observe instead of act, that judgment was rising. Not to accuse, not to destroy, just to be seen, and the stars were not ready. The transmission spread, not from Earth, from the Watchers themselves, leaked, shared, debated, on distant stations, on neutral worlds, on broadcast networks that once erased Earth's name from their maps. Now they played the message again and again, and the people who had never met a human, who had only heard the stories of chaos and collapse, now heard a voice, calm, cold, focused, a voice that did not ask to be liked. A voice that did not ask at all, and across the galaxy, something began to happen that none of the Watchers could control. They listened, not just to the words, to the tone, to the stillness behind it, to the shape of the silence that followed. They imagined what kind of world could produce a message like that. They imagined what kind of people chose to speak that way, and then they imagined what would happen if that world, if those people ever looked up again. Because that was what the message truly said, not in language, in implication, in presence. It said, "We are not looking at you yet," and the galaxy began to flinch, because they realized Earth had spoken not from desperation, but from position. A position of waiting, of watching, of knowing, and if Earth had waited this long to speak once, then it could wait forever. They had not heard the beginning of a new communication. They had heard the end of an old one. The final statement of a species that had already made its choice to rise, but not return, to breathe, but not beg, to stare, but not answer. And for those who had hovered above for lifetimes, who had written Earth off as a tragedy, the realization came with a weight they were not ready to carry, because now they understood. Earth did not send out a message so they would come. Earth sent it so we would remember who never did. And memory, it turns out, does not fade in silence, it sharpens. There was a time when the only thing we trusted was noise. Our towers screamed with signal. Our devices blinked endlessly into the dark. We shouted across oceans, across space, into the black void between stars, always hoping someone would answer. But when the fires came, and the screams were swallowed by smoke, and the towers cracked into silence, we did not forget how to speak. We remembered why we once had to, and then we stopped. Not out of fear, not because our voices failed, because we realized no one had ever been listening, not really. The Watchers recorded every burst of radiation, every collapsing cry, every final message scraped from dying machines, but they never heard us. They never felt us, so we stopped trying to explain, and in that stillness, in the space where speech once tried to rescue us, something deeper emerged, something older than technology, something human enough to defy language. We began to remember ourselves without sound, in rhythm, in pattern, in presence. It started with movement, not coordinated, not designed, just shared. Across fractured continents, scattered survivors began to gather again, not under flags, not under orders, but under stars. Fires were lit in places untouched for generations. Entire forests glowed at night, not from machines, but from synchronized pulse. Lanterns built from bioluminescent molds passed from one elder to another. Across deserts, shapes appeared carved not into the sand, but grown into it, living patterns that pulsed underfoot when walked upon in silence. The children of Earth no longer looked upward with longing or hatred. They looked inward, and through them the planet began to breathe, not metaphorically, measurably. The Accord's Watchers began detecting shifts in resonance beneath the crust long, slow waves that did not correspond to tectonic activity,
weather, or known human infrastructure. When they analyzed the frequencies, they found harmonics intervals that matched known patterns of human breath, of heartbeat, of thought. Earth was pulsing in rhythm with its own people, a civilization reawakening without a word. The Accord panicked in silence. They could not report an enemy because nothing had attacked. They could not propose diplomacy because nothing had been said, and they could not predict what would happen next because no pattern matched what Earth was becoming. A species once defined by noise, by chaos, by reaction had become still, and in that stillness it had become unified, not by governments, not by war, by grief, practiced grief, grief held so long it had crystallized into culture. A way of being, a planetary rhythm. Across the wastelands, small groups began walking the same paths, not mapped, not marked, but when viewed from orbit they formed spirals. Spirals that stretched from shorelines to mountains, from deserts to frozen cities, intersecting with ancient ruins in ways that suggested intention, but no living human ever spoke of it. They just walked. They just remembered, and when they reached each other, they did not shout, they did not sing, they simply stood together in silence, and the land remembered with them. Hills vibrated with wind that seemed to follow their breath. Storms slowed above them, moving in rhythm with their presence, and beneath it all the planet listened. This was not religion, it was not magic, it was not science, it was human. A kind of human the galaxy had never seen, a kind of memory too wide to code and too deep to explain. In ancient cities once erased by orbital fire, glowing symbols began to appear again, not etched, not painted, grown, flora that bent toward residual sorrow, moss that pulsed faintly in the rhythm of old lullabies, creatures born after the fall that responded not to speech, but to heartbeat, flocking to those who remembered the most, and Earth responded in kind. Not in rain, in pattern. Storms drifted where they once destroyed. Winds carried scents that mirrored the memories of those who walked alone. The watchers recorded it all, and still understood nothing. Because they believed unity required structure, that survival required hierarchy, they did not understand that humans, when shattered, do not always rebuild. Sometimes they become. We became pattern. We became soil. We became memory carved into movement. There were no leaders, no announcements, only presence. A grandmother would walk out at night and hum the same 6 notes her mother had taught her before the fall and 50 kilometers away. Another would answer, never having met. Children drew circles in the dirt that matched ancient orbital maps no longer taught. Across the planet, the same symbols returned not because they were taught, but because they were inherited, not through books. Through blood, through grief carried so deeply it rewrote instinct, and the galaxy began to feel it. The watchers called it psychic emergence, a planetary preconsciousness. They debated protocols for isolation, even quarantine. But they missed the truth. There was no contagion, no anomaly. There was only remembrance, the final form of grief, because when a people lose everything and no one comes to save them, and no one answers their final breath, they do not forget. They synchronize, and now Earth was synchronizing with itself, not with commands, with awareness, with motion, with stillness, with memory so intact that it no longer needed language to survive, and still we said nothing. No broadcast, no diplomacy, no vengeance, just presence, and that, more than any weapon, made the stars afraid, because they could not predict what came next. A people who grieve that deeply, who wait that long, who rise without rage, they are not like the ones who scream. They are not like the ones who threaten. They are the ones who remember, who carry every silence ever given to them, and offer it back to the sky not as punishment, but as truth, as witness, as proof that they endured. And now we were enduring as one. Humanity remembered itself without sound, and the silence had never been louder. They thought the silence was their shield, that orbit was distance enough, that watching without acting made them safe from consequence. They thought the wreckage they observed from above would remain broken forever, that Earth would never find its feet again, let alone its voice. But they had misunderstood what silence really meant. They saw quiet as surrender, stillness as compliance, absence of noise as absence of threat. And now, as the surface began to move with patterns they could not decrypt, as humans no longer reached upward but listened inward, as memory spread without signal and awareness rose without warning, the sky began to change not in light, not in sound, but in feeling. Ships stationed above Earth began reporting glitches, not mechanical, psychological,
Officers spoke of pressure where there was none, of a weight that settled on their chests while they slept, of waking from dreams that were not theirs. Dreams of burning forests, of children holding hands in silence as fire consumed the air, of a voice whispering nothing but still being heard. Logs were reviewed, sleep patterns analyzed, neural scans conducted. All results showed the same thing, perfect health, no malfunction, and yet they all felt it, the feeling of being watched. It began slowly. One station at the edge of orbit reported a momentary loss of telemetry. Not a blackout, a stutter, as if something passed between it and the planet, but nothing was there, no heat, no object, no anomaly, just a flicker. Then another station reported the same, then a ship. Then a fleet, and slowly, over weeks, the pattern grew, not random, coordinated, perfectly spaced interruptions, always brief, always cold, as if Earth was blinking, watching, breathing, responding, not with threats, not with force, with attention, with the same terrible, focused silence that the stars had once given to Earth in its hour of dying, and now that silence had become a mirror, and the sky flinched. Aboard the Accord command vessel, the highest orbiting structure above Earth, Admiral Revas stood before his officers and stared at the live feed from the surface. Nothing moved, but nothing had to. The feeds were full of ancient cities wrapped in green, of broken towers now carved with glowing moss, of figures walking slowly along impossible patterns, their heads never tilted skyward, their voices never raised, their pace never urgent. But to Revas it felt like pressure, like gravity from a world that had no right to pull any more. He asked for confirmation of the last transmission from Earth, the message, the final one. It had not repeated. It had not altered, it had not replied to any response. It simply sat there in the archives, in their minds, in their sleep. A voice that had not asked for help, had not demanded justice, had not even said goodbye. It had remembered, and that was worse. Across the other fleets, morale began to erode, not from conflict, from attention. Officers began resigning. Pilots avoided Earth rotation. One by one, observation drones failed to return. Their data logs showed no interference, no damage, just silence. They had stopped, or turned away, or forgotten why they were sent. One ship reported that its entire sensor array had been wiped clean, not by EMP, not by hack, but as if Earth had never existed at all. It showed only ocean, only stars, as if the planet had removed itself from the network. These events were dismissed as coincidences, then anomalies, then edge case errors, but deep down, the watchers knew what was happening. Earth was responding, not with fire, with presence, with the unbearable weight of having waited too long to be seen. The Accord called for emergency protocol revisions. Debate erupted in hushed halls. Some argued that Earth should be reclassified as a Class Gray threat, not hostile, but unapproachable. Others wanted a peace envoy. Still others wanted to leave orbit altogether, but no one dared descend. No one volunteered to land, not anymore, because the fear was no longer of what humanity might do. The fear was of what Earth might reveal, that every eye in orbit might not survive being truly seen. That every watcher might have to face the truth that they had floated above the dying world for generations and done nothing, and that now the world remembered them, not with rage, but with awareness. And there is nothing more terrifying than being noticed by something you left to die. So they watched the surface, and Earth said nothing, no signal, no fleet, no warning, just the same slow movements. The same walking figures, the same patterns, until one day something shifted, not in orbit, in perception. Someone whispered it first. No one recorded who, but the words echoed across ships, across halls, across silent comms. I think it is looking at us. And in that moment the sky flinched again, because it was true, and they had never known how much it would hurt to be seen. They built monuments to the civilizations they failed to save. Marble rings floating in the black, each etched with the names of fallen species, whole cultures reduced to syllables carved in cold stone. Earth had never earned a ring, not because it was forgotten, because it was ignored. It had been studied, monitored, dissected in silence, but never given a monument, never granted a memorial, because to the Accord Earth was never sacred. It was loud, primitive, excessive, a warning perhaps, but never a tragedy. And now, as the planet pulsed with memory, as the air itself began to hum with presence, the stars began to realize that the mistake had not been in failing to save Earth. The mistake had been in failing to remember it existed. And that realization, more than anything, began to break them, because Earth had not roared back with fire, it had not demanded anything, it had simply endured. It had stood still long enough to let the stars bury it. Then it rose, not upward, inward, and in doing so, became something that could not be erased. Because memory, when carried with silence, becomes weight, and the galaxy was not prepared to carry the weight of Earth. Across ships that had never descended to the surface, personnel began leaving anonymous logs, messages, confessions. Some spoke of guilt they could not explain, a feeling in their skin, a dream they had not dreamed before they orbited Earth. Images of cities drowning, of children standing barefoot in dust that used to be schools, of voices not screaming but whispering a single phrase over and over, "Do not forget us." These officers had never seen Earth during the fall, had never smelled the fires or tasted the ash, and yet the memories were there, detailed, vivid, personal. Accord psychologists blamed stress, environmental bleed, through hypnosis via loaf, frequency patterns emitted by the planet. But deep down they knew Earth was not sending them anything. It was simply holding its breath, and in that breath they began to remember what they had never seen, because the planet had never needed to rise. It only needed to be remembered, and now it was. In a hidden chamber aboard the oldest observation station, a technician found something strange, a data file dated centuries before, marked as irrelevant. A sound file 20 seconds long, untitled. It had never been flagged, never been analyzed. It had simply existed in the database unnoticed, forgotten, until now. The technician played it. It was not static. It was not speech, it was a heartbeat, human, slow, even, recorded during Earth's final transmission window, years after the last official communication. No voice, no distress, just a single heartbeat in perfect rhythm. And then silence. The file was passed around quietly. Officers listened alone in their quarters in the dark, and one by one they stopped writing reports, stopped recording logs. Some requested reassignment. Others vanished from the rosters entirely, not because they were afraid of Earth, because they understood it, and once they did, they could no longer orbit in silence. One senior commander wrote a single line in his resignation note. "We did not lose Earth. We lost the right to pretend we remembered it." In the cities far below, the movement continued. Still no words, still no flag, still no demand, but now the patterns were spreading faster. More precise. Paths once walked in silence now bloomed with moss that glowed faintly when footsteps touched them. The energy fields surrounding the planet began to shift, not expand, resonate. Signals bounced off the atmosphere and returned inverted, transformed. Accord ships tried to recalibrate, but each adjustment made things worse. They were not being jammed, they were being answered, not with message, with echo. The planet was mirroring everything now, not just data. Feeling, and the watchers began to feel things they could not name. Sorrow, guilt, the cold ache of standing above a grave you helped dig but never admitted to. And then, one night, cycle later, a single pod launched from orbit. It was unarmed, uncrewed, a ceremonial capsule, the kind used to deliver tokens of peace or apology. It had no message, just a single object inside a stone, smooth and black, wrapped in silk woven with the seal of the Accord. It was dropped into the Pacific. No human retrieved it, no human needed to, but when it sank, the clouds above the region parted, just once. Just long enough for every orbital scanner to catch the exact moment light from the stars broke through, and reflected back off the surface of the water in a pattern no one had ever seen before, a perfect ring. Like the monuments they had built for others, Earth had made its own, but not for the galaxy, for us, for the ones who endured it. The message was clear. You do not get to grieve us now. We grieved ourselves. We remembered ourselves. You watched. We carried each other. And that was the lesson they had never wanted to learn. That Earth had not needed the stars. That in the end, humanity had never needed to rise to meet the galaxy. It had only needed to remember what it had lost, what it had become. And in that remembrance it had become something the galaxy could not understand.
a civilization that did not measure power in fleets but in grief. That did not answer in rage but in rhythm. That did not call for help but stood still until the galaxy remembered it had once been human too. And now that memory echoed upward, not to be answered, but to remind the stars what silence really costs. Long before Earth cracked open under the weight of its own fire, long before the last cities fell quiet and the final voice whispered into the void, humanity knew what the galaxy would do. Not how, not when, but what. We knew that when the end came the stars would watch, not because they hated us, but because they feared something deeper than war. They feared the truth buried beneath our surface. Not the surface of our world, the surface of our story. They feared what humanity hid when it fell, and now, centuries later, as the planet thrummed with patterns too complex to map and rhythms too synchronized to be accidental, the Watchers were beginning to understand. They were not orbiting a ruin, they were orbiting a memory, and memories, when buried deep enough in silence, do not die. They ferment, they evolve, they become something heavier, and now Earth was unearthing not weapons, not warnings, but proof that we had never needed rescue. That we had buried our answers not in code, but in the very shape of how we endured. The first signal they missed had not come from a satellite. It came from beneath the Mariana Trench, a pulse, a resonance wave that mirrored the exact frequency of the human brain in deep sleep. The signal rose slowly, humming through tectonic plates, cresting into mountain ranges and echoing through collapsed subway lines in a tone that felt like breath. But no message followed, no directive. Just rhythm. The stars dismissed it. Background noise, but the surface began to respond. Trees not native to any region began blooming out of season. Sand dunes aligned in mathematically perfect spirals. Glaciers cracked in harmonies that matched ancient lullabies once sung by a people who no longer existed. And in these strange awakenings, the stars began to ask the question they should have asked long ago. What did humanity leave behind, and more importantly, why had they buried it? They assumed we had died out clinging to technology, that in our final moments we had tried to upload our minds, automate our defense, fire one last desperate shot into the stars. But they had misunderstood. Humanity had never tried to escape its fall. It had prepared for it, not to survive through machines, but to be remembered by the planet itself. Earth had not been a battlefield. It had been a vessel, a vault, a monument so subtle it had fooled even those who had walked across its surface. Because we did not hide our legacy in data, we hid it in pattern, in breath, in footsteps. In synchronized grief, we wove our survival into the rhythm of being alive, and now that rhythm was resurfacing, not through speech, through presence, and the presence was growing. Drones dispatched to collect samples reported interference. Not mechanical, biological. Plants would wither upon contact with synthetic materials. Audio feeds would distort only when recording living voices. One drone captured video of a child, maybe 10 years old, standing in the middle of a field, eyes closed, palms upward. She said nothing, but around her the grass bent in circles, perfect, slow, moving circles that spun outward for over 2 kilometers. The moment the drone tried to transmit, it went dark, not damaged, not blocked. It simply forgot how to be a machine. Engineers recovered the hardware. No faults, no errors, but the logs had changed. The drone had begun recording poetry, not written, etched into its drive. Lines describing rain, fire, silence, and grief. They thought it was a hoax, until the second drone did the same, then a third, then a ship. Orbiting vessels began to experience strange delays, navigational data taking seconds longer than expected, but only when facing Earth. As if the planet was slowing time, not literally, emotionally, ships found themselves drifting, pausing mid-course, repeating scans. Officers reported hearing songs in the static of their comms, songs no 2 people could agree on, but all described the same way. Familiar, like a lullaby you forgot you knew, they started calling it the ghost hum. Some believed it was Earth itself, singing. Others said it was the collective guilt of the Watchers, finally becoming audible. One old archivist aboard an Accord carrier whispered the truth no one else would say aloud. This is not new. Earth has always been alive. We just buried it under our own noise. The statement was ignored officially. But unofficially the theory spread.
Earth was not sending signals, it was responding to attention. The more the stars focused on it, the more it unfolded, like a flower blooming toward heat, but instead of light it responded to witnessing. To being watched, to being remembered, and that was what terrified them, because they realized what they had buried was not a culture, not a city, but a reckoning, a truth they had always tried to avoid. That they had watched Earth die, not from distance, but from apathy, from classification, from deciding that a species in freefall was not worth interrupting, and now that same species had become something else. Something that remembered every moment of its own extinction and still did not speak because it did not have to. The children walking the spiral paths no longer looked upward. They placed their hands to the ground and listened. They hummed the same 7 tones over and over, with no variation, no language, no call. And when measured from orbit, those tones produced shapes not random. Shapes matching orbital charts, gravitic anomalies, even the neural mapping patterns of known empathic species. Earth had become a chorus, not of music, of memory, and memory, when weaponized by the quiet, becomes unbearable to those who refuse to act when it mattered. Across the Accord fleet, one phrase began to circulate. Not as a command, as a whisper, they buried something. No one could say what, not exactly, but they all felt it, and some began to believe that what Earth had buried was not data, not defiance, not even hope. It had buried witnesses, not dead, just waiting, and now those witnesses were rising, slowly, together, without need for declaration, because the final stage of grief is not acceptance, it is becoming. And Earth had become something the galaxy could no longer ignore. They had measured us by our noise, judged us by our chaos, dismissed us because our wars were loud and our peace was brief. And when we finally fell silent, when the last signal blinked out, they told themselves it was over. That humanity had finally done what the galaxy always expected, burned itself down and left nothing but ash. They hovered above the silence and wrote reports. They drafted policy. They updated threat matrices and wrote our name in dust. But they never stepped down, never reached out, never asked why the silence remained so steady, so patient, so impossibly whole, because deep down they feared what the silence might mean. And now, centuries later, as the sky rippled with the weight of everything they chose not to remember, as Earth began to rise not through force but through presence, the watchers could no longer deny the truth clawing through every sensor, every pattern, every child's breath below. We had never vanished, we had never surrendered, we had waited, not for them, for us. And now that we were waking, not in fire but in unity, not with vengeance but with rhythm, the stars were finally realizing that the silence they had mistaken for death had only been the inhale before we became something more. The first real shift happened without noise, as always, no tremor, no explosion, just motion. Orbiting vessels began detecting synchronized surface movement across thousands of kilometers. From tundras to forests, deserts to ruins, humans began walking again. Not in panic, not in escape, in circles, spirals within spirals, perfect geometry executed without leaders, without commands, each footstep matching an ancient pattern carved into the crust before any modern satellite had ever mapped it. The shapes were not just mathematical, they were neurological. Accord analysts were forced to admit the horrifying possibility. The paths mirrored the firing patterns of the human brain during memory retrieval. Earth was remembering through its people, through its soil, through movement passed down not in language but in trauma. Every child that walked those patterns had been born generations after the collapse, and yet they moved with precision that could not be taught, as if the land itself was speaking through them, as if silence had become an organ. Above them, ships drifted farther from assigned positions. Pilots began requesting new rotation windows, not from danger, from dread, from the unbearable feeling of being seen by something that refused to acknowledge their presence, because Earth never looked up. Not once, but it noticed, and the noticing became a weight, a gravity of intent. One captain said it best before resigning, "They are not ignoring us, they are watching to see if we blink." And blink they did. In the command archives, someone uncovered an old diplomatic doctrine written before the collapse, a contingency clause. It outlined what Earth should do if galactic observation ever occurred without contact. It did not suggest outreach. It did not call for alliance. It called for stillness, for endurance, for a planetary silence so complete it would either force the stars to intervene or to prove they never cared. The doctrine was ignored in its time, laughed at. Now it was prophecy, and Earth had followed it perfectly, not because of orders, because it had become the order. It had synchronized with its own memory, its own trauma, its own breath. And the result was a species no longer defined by war or invention or desperation, but by presence. We were not attacking, we were becoming, and nothing in the sky could understand what that meant. That is when the first descent happened. Not theirs, ours. A single craft rose from the surface, human, built, old but alive, carved with vines, its engines pulsing not with fuel but with soundless resonance. It ascended through the atmosphere without request, without announcement. Accord vessels panicked, scrambled to intercept, but the craft made no deviation, no threat. It simply passed through them, not physically, intellectually. The data feeds monitoring its trajectory collapsed. Not from jamming, from incompatibility. Their machines could not perceive it. They saw it, but they did not understand it. It flew between fleets like fog through fingers. Some tried to hail it, others tried to flee. But the ship made no response, because it had never come to speak. It had come to witness, to rise above the clouds and show them what we had become. The ship stopped above the monument ring, that cold string of stone built to honor the lost species of the galaxy. Earth had never been given a place there, until now. The human vessel hovered for exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. Then it released a pulse, not electromagnetic, not sonic, a pulse of memory. Every ship in orbit received it differently. For some, it came as dreams, for others, as hallucinations. For the Accord flagship, it came as a child's voice saying a name they did not recognize, but all agreed on the feeling we remember. Not you ourselves. The transmission carried no coordinates, no demand. It simply settled into the mind like a melody you cannot forget. And then the ship descended again, slowly, silently, as if it had never left. As if it had only gone up to remind the sky that silence was never absence. It was waiting. In the days that followed, Earth began to glow, not with fire, with rhythm. Patterns of light appeared across the continents, not electrical. Biological, moss, coral, wind, ice, rain all moving in harmony. The planet had become a breathing organism of pattern, and above it the stars wept data they could not explain. Earth had passed beyond comprehension. It was not sending information, it was sending intention, the intention to remember, to endure, to rise without lifting a single weapon. And that, above all, is what broke the Watchers, because they realized what they had actually seen when they watched us die. They had seen patience, not defeat, resolve, not ruin. They had seen a people who had chosen silence because the galaxy was not worth the sound. And now, as that silence bloomed into presence, into identity, into something far larger than civilization, the galaxy could no longer pretend it was above us. It had watched us die, and now it would have to watch what we become. Because we had never tried to rise to meet them, we had risen to meet ourselves, and now, from the ashes of being forgotten, we stood not to threaten, but to exist. And existence, when shaped by grief and bound by silence, becomes unstoppable. They waited, every fleet, every outpost, every listening drone suspended above Earth like breath caught in a dying throat. They waited for a message, a warning, a final declaration of what humanity had become. They prepared for retaliation, for confrontation, for something loud, but Earth said nothing. No new signal came, no ship rose, no banner was raised. The patterns continued, the spirals widened, the songs in the dirt grew stronger. But the planet remained silent, and that silence, that unbearable, deliberate silence, became the final sound the galaxy would ever hear from Earth, because Earth had remembered, Earth had grieved. And now Earth had become, it did not need to speak. It was the message, it had always been the message. The galaxy had simply never been still enough to hear it. Until now, the Accord filed a final report. They did not publish it. It simply existed in a classified archive, marked with a single red tag: observation terminated. Planetary consciousness unquantifiable. The words meant nothing to most. But to those who had seen Earth, hovered above its breath,
watched its children walk in perfect rhythm without instruction or language. It meant everything, because Earth had reached a form the galaxy did not understand. It had not evolved upward, it had evolved inward. It had found harmony not through control, but through shared grief, not through technology, but through memory, and that memory had become law, not political law. Biological law, the kind of truth that roots itself into stone and weather and flesh, and never needs to be spoken again. One by one, the ships began to leave orbit, not in retreat, in reverence. There was nothing left to study, nothing left to fear, only a weight they could no longer carry. Some fleets tried to erase the records, tried to pretend Earth had never risen again, but the memory followed them. Aboard every vessel that ever looked down and saw the spirals, there remained a pressure, a heartbeat they could not silence, a rhythm they could not forget, a quiet too perfect to escape. Earth had not broadcast. It had witnessed, and in that witnessing, it had undone the galaxy, not through power, through presence, a presence that refused to be explained. No human ever left Earth again, not because they could not, because they no longer needed to. What lived on the surface had passed beyond escape. They were not building to leave, they were building to remain, not in stasis, in sovereignty, a planetary kind of peace. A civilization of silence that did not need to expand because it had already become too large to measure. Every breath on that planet moved in time with its soil. Every step remembered the ones before it. Every child born knew how to walk the spirals before their first word, and most never spoke at all, not out of trauma, but because they were whole, in a way the stars had never imagined possible. It was a diplomat from the Ashari who said it best in a closed session 3 decades later. They are not broken, they are complete. They did not ascend, they rooted. The galaxy spins, but Earth remains. The message echoed through the halls of empires, but no action followed, because there was nothing left to fix. Earth did not want diplomacy, did not want revenge, did not even want acknowledgement. It wanted only to be, and that desire, that quiet insistence on being whole without the need for permission, became the most dangerous truth the galaxy had ever known. Because it proved that salvation did not come from fleets or treaties or dominance. It came from remembering, from refusing to forget who we are even when the sky forgets us, from standing in the ruins and choosing not to scream, but to endure. In the final years of the Accord's presence above Earth, a single event occurred that would never be explained. Every ship in orbit, at the same moment, experienced a systems blackout, total silence. No readings, no lights, no navigation, just black, for precisely 27 seconds. When power returned, nothing had changed, no attack, no damage, only one thing, a single symbol etched into the forward-facing glass of every vessel. Not burned, not scratched, grown like frost but permanent, a spiral, simple, delicate, identical, and beneath it, a single line in Earth's dead language. We were always enough, there was no panic, no anger, just stillness. The watchers finally understood, not just the message, the truth, that Earth had never spoken because it had never needed to, that everything worth saying had already been carved into its soil, breathed into its forests, held in the silence between each human's heartbeat. And in the face of a galaxy built on noise, Earth had whispered the only thing that ever mattered: remember us, not so we would be saved, but so we would not be erased. And when the last ship left orbit, Earth did not flicker, did not follow, did not rise. It simply continued, one rhythm, one breath, one world, a silence so vast it became a presence so deep it became a legend, and a legend so true it needed no words. Earth never spoke again. It did not need to, because now the galaxy was listening forever.